Hello to my comrades of all genders, and especially hello to my comrades of no gender at all. It's your brother, post-structuralism. I'm back to talk today about a topic that just grinds my fucking gears. I'm here to talk about trans men, specifically queer trans men, the people who date us and fetishize us, often known as chasers. And above all, because I love sadness and misery, I'm here to destroy a seminal piece of my childhood, the anime Ouran High School Host Club. If you're not familiar with it, don't worry, I'll be showing clips. And just before I get into it, of course, this topic addresses serious transphobia as well as sexual violence, as you can probably tell from the sort of broad heading. But if you don't like that stuff, then maybe don't watch. Also, at the end of this intro, I just wanted to give credit to a really cool YouTube account that I found called Art of Paya, which was the inspiration for the Draw With Me format that I have been using in the last couple videos. So I just wanted to give them a shout out because I don't know if I did previously. Anyway, let's switch to the drawing camera and get into it.
Kiss, kiss for love. Hey, hey, hey.
Yo, real talk though, the number one reason to cancel Auron High School Host Club is because of the fucking Avril Lavigne copyright infringement. Like, really? She let them use that for all this shitty transphobic garbage? Like, why? Anyway, that's a whole side tangent, but the real reason I'm here today is to talk about dating as a queer trans man. Particularly, I want to talk about the phenomenon of chasers, and more broadly, what kind of men in particular end up dating trans men and trans masculine people. So I'm gonna start by doing this illustration based on Auron High School Host Club. My premise was sort of, what if Tamaki and Haruhi met again as adults? You've just seen my brief character sketches, which were really messy, but I kind of just ended up using it as like a brainstorming rather than using the actual designs that I had come up with in that previous page for the full illustration. As far as the topic of, dating cis men as a trans guy, that's something that I obviously have been thinking about for a really long time as part of my life experience. But I really struggled with whether to actually write this idea down and kind of like put it out there. One of the reasons is because I think transness in general is thought of as being a sex thing, like just way too much. Like this one time I told this old lady my pronouns and she immediately fucking crossed herself and told me she didn't want to hear about my sex life. Like, lady, I didn't tell you anything about my sex life. All I said was like, call me he and him. But that's how a lot of people react, and I think in light of that over-sexualization of transness in general, it makes me feel weird to openly discuss aspects of transsexuality, especially because I know that cis people really eat it up, and that's what they most often want to see from us. In particular, we see the hypersexualization of trans women that both informs the violence that they experience from cis men, as well as the fear-mongering against them that cis women participate in. And while trans masculinity is also hypersexualized, it's mostly not talked about at all, which I guess is why I'm here. A lot has already been said by trans women about the sexual fetishization of trans women and how it features into their dating life, whether it's by YouTubers like Cat Black or ContraPoints, or even media representations like the storylines of Elektra and Angel in the show Pose. In a lot of those cases, we can see how trans feminine folks are often pursued by cis men who are very adamantly straight, but because of social transphobia, they feel a deep ambivalence about their attraction to trans women. This is often why trans women experience violence from their sexual partners, because the men feel that being attracted to trans women makes them gay, not in their own hearts, but in the eyes of others around them, especially other straight men. But as I said, lots of ladies have spoken about these experiences themselves, and I really can't speak firsthand to that experience, so please don't take my word on it, but seek out what they have to say. Instead, I'm here to talk about trans masculine folks. So I guess first I should step back and define my terms real quick. So transmasculine, or transmasc, is a shorthand that I use to refer to trans men, as well as other assigned female at birth trans people who express themselves in a primarily masculine way. It's kind of a messy term, but I'm trying to speak to an overlap between trans men and certain non-binary people who experience a particular kind of transphobia and gendered violence because of two things. First, being assigned female at birth, and second, expressing themselves in a masculine way. And again, assigned female at birth means that the doctor looked at the baby upon birth or through an ultrasound or karyotype and announced, it's a girl. Yeah, that's right, by the way, I said karyotype. For all the cis out there who think they're defending genetics and biology from trans people, most of us know more about that shit than you do. Anyway, so another subgroup that I'm going to focus on is trans masculine folks who date and are attracted to men. Partially because I'm self-centered, though actually, if you combine trans men who identify as gay or bi with trans men who have had sex with men in their recent history, about 2/3 of trans men are queer. This really turns on its head the whole idea that trans men are transitioning for convenience or social privilege. You know, a lot of people buy into this, even in the book Female Masculinity. Jay Halberstam, who themselves become a transmasculine individual, kind of perpetuate the stereotype that trans men essentially are seeking out the privileges of being straight men and that they transition and basically participate in the same chauvinism that cis men do. And that's really not true because most of us actually don't get to re-socialize as passing straight men. But also, as many lesbians, straight trans men, and honestly just women and queers in general know, whether you're attracted to a man often factors very little into whether they think they have a shot with you and how aggressively they pursue you. I think men's social power, and particularly their socialization to be sexually aggressive, is a big reason why we often have to focus on the behavior of cis men in situations of sexual violence, which isn't to say that cis women don't have transphobic and fraught relationships with trans men and envies too. There's definitely a particular kind of transphobia in queer women's circles that aggressively both include and belittle trans men, including trans men who are there dating. But again, that's not really my experience as I've never dated women long term. Part 2. Who are the chasers? Okay, enough burying the lead. What kind of guys are attracted to trans men, especially early transition trans men or trans men who don't pass? Often, it's guys who are bi or gay, but not out of the closet. In my early transition, I often found that openly gay men had no interest at all in me. Yet, there were guys who really were interested, often guys who struggled to date cis women. Several guys who had crushes on me in high school, who were often virulently transphobic towards me, subsequently came out as gay. Similarly, as an adult, for a while I hooked up with someone who expressed a sexual preference, in his own words, neither for women nor for men, but exclusively for trans people. Why? Well, as far as I can tell, for closeted guys, dating trans masks represents a safe way to act on their attraction to masculinity without having to make real ripples in their social life or sense of identity. On the one hand, you get to be with someone who looks and acts like a boy, often a cute, younger-looking boy, but on the other hand, other people perceive you to be in a heterosexual relationship. Often cis men who date trans masks expect that having sex with a trans man will be the same as having sex with a woman, that the trans guy will be cool with frontal sex or that they will always be the bottom. This reveals that at the root of this behavior is often a very deep transphobia. Also, I don't want to say that trans men who have this sexual behavior aren't real men or invalidate them in any way, just that the expectation that trans men will be just quote-unquote bonus hole boys is a transphobic one. Sorry, I just had to kick my dog out of the room. If you can ever hear weird background noises in my videos, it's usually because dog. Also, I just wanted to say that, you know, this kind of transphobic dynamic, you can also sometimes see it in relationships between trans masculine folks. Often there's this kind of posturing where one person is trying to prove that they're more masculine than the other, which is rooted in transphobia as well. I've experienced both ends of this, from a relationship with another trans mask that ended with them using their greater strength to sexually assault me, to situations where I dated more femme non-binary people for a while before realizing that the only thing I liked about dating them was that they made me feel more like a man. At the core, this is all about how fragile masculinity and masculine sexual identities are. Cis men who date trans women struggle with the feeling that they're gay, even though they're clearly attracted to their girlfriends as women, and so they hide their relationships with trans women. Conversely, cis men who date trans men suppress their attraction to men precisely by dating men while acting the entire time as if the men that they are dating are women. And these relationships between trans and cis men often also contain violence, often very similar violence to the violence that cis women experience when they try to push against their gender roles. I find it very difficult to express the overlaps that I've observed between transphobia and misogyny when it comes to trans masks. I was chatting with a trans girl once, and she asked me if I thought that trans men also experience trans misogyny, because it's clear that the experiences that we face reflect both disgust of and fear of trans people, as well as good old-fashioned putting women in their place. I replied that I think misogyny plays a part for sure, but I wouldn't refer to it as trans misogyny, as that term is used specifically to refer to the sexism that trans women face. Trans men's experiences certainly are different, and how our experiences differ is largely because of erasure. Often, the form of discrimination we experience comes in the form of us perceived as silly girls who are not able to determine or evaluate our own experiences, including our experiences of being men. This is similar to the point of almost being identical with lesbians who experience sexual violence from men, ostensibly quote-unquote for their own good, or to quote-unquote correct them. But I'm not willing to concede that trans men's oppression is the same as sexism experienced by cis women, even cis lesbians. As one study of trans men in the workplace showed, when trans men transition, unless they are lucky enough to be tall, white, straight, and perfectly passing, most of us experience, at best, the same that we did when people thought we were women, which is already a bad outcome if you experience gender dysphoria from being treated as a woman. And at worst, we experience severe harassment and assault by people as a reaction to our transness. If we can say that cis women's oppression often works to confine them into their gender roles, trans masks' oppression does something similar, but even more so, because it's not just about what kind of women we are demanded to be, but in fact that we are demanded to be women. Even when we are murdered, the news stories often report our killings as murders of women, just part of the apparently never-ending tide of men killing their women partners, which we've all for some reason decided to be okay with. So even in our memorials, trans masks are being forced into the role of women. And I'm also not here to say that trans masks have it worse than anybody else. I think it honestly varies with folks' individual experiences and what else they have going on. Similarly, when I talk about how trans men are erased while trans women are sensationalized, I'm not trying to claw back some kind of gold medal in the oppression Olympics for trans men. Instead, I'm trying to point out how we are siloed off from one another by the overemphasis on either comparing our kinds of oppression and showing them as completely different in some kind of hierarchy, or on the other hand, the impulse to try and show that all oppression is the same. Trans women are hypersexualized and sensationalized, especially when they are attacked, which leads to more attacks against them. Trans men are hidden and ignored, and so the violence that takes place against us is hidden and ignored too. Similarly, comparing how different groups of women and trans folks experience patriarchy can show different aspects of patriarchy that are interrelated but also conflicting. Like how people can experience patriarchal pushback for acting too feminine or for acting too masculine, depending on who they are. Plenty of cis women feminists have pointed out that if women are very feminine and interested in things like fashion or makeup, they are belittled and treated as less intelligent. But if women are very assertive or interested in masculine areas, they can experience violence and be pushed back toward conventionally feminine interests and behaviors. This shows that patriarchy is designed to reinforce the boundaries of gender roles on every side. But when you add a trans analysis to this, it reveals how patriarchy is also about enforcing gender assignment. When trans masculine people experience violence for being masculine, it's not just about people trying to make us behave femininely. After all, if I was a feminine trans man, I would probably still experience the same amount, if not more, transphobia. Instead, the violence that we experience for presenting ourselves masculinely is about patriarchy showing us, by force or sexual violence if necessary, that in its eyes we inherently are women, forcing us into that role. But we're not. For me, I always have to come back to that, what I know to be true and what I observe to be true in myself and other trans masculine folks. In a way, how cis folks are threatened by our masculinity is proof in and of itself that we really are men, because if we were just little girls dressing up in our dad's clothing, people wouldn't be that bothered by it. Part 3. Epistemology of the closet. This is especially true because one of the things that the cis men who date us struggle with is their own internalized homophobia, the experience of being in the closet. My partner now is a bisexual cis dude. I mean, actually he's two-spirit, but that's a whole other story that I don't feel able to speak to firsthand. But for the purposes of his socialization, he's a bisexual cis dude, and despite dating cis and trans men before dating me, he never came out to his family and friends before we were together, and he went through years of dating cis women as beards, primarily while hooking up with men. While my partner was open with himself about being queer before we were dating, it was news to their friends and family, and among the trans and homophobic members of that group, the issue is often framed as being my trans identity, my gender presentation, and unwillingness to conform to a feminine gender role. Why won't I dress more femininely? Why won't I have kids? Instead of the real thing that they're upset about, which is that my partner is attracted to men, a group which just happens to include me. One of the only representations I've seen of the dynamic of trans masks in relationship with cis men is in the show Feel Good, for which, spoilers ahead, and really, please watch this show, it's actually excellent. In that show, the main character, May, struggles with addiction and their gender identity while working through trauma around a relationship that they were in as a teenager. In the book I Hope We Choose Love, Kai Cheng Tom points out that one of the reasons there is so much sexual violence in queer community is because many of us leave home very young due to situations of family abuse, and that we're simultaneously trying to find family and love while having a very warped idea of what love is because of the abuse that we've experienced. May's romance with the fuckface who I don't care to look up the name of reflects this really well. They're kicked out of their house as a teenager due to addiction and mental health struggles, and are taken in by a much older man who frequents the comedy club that they've been doing stand-up at. The man provides them with a place to stay and a start in the comedy industry, but he also enables their cocaine addiction and grooms them into a sexual relationship even though they're 16 and he's presumably in his 30s. One of the striking things about this relationship is that the guy consistently refers to May in a very feminized way, as pretty or as a little girl, even though May is 30 years old at the time of the show, and very masculine presenting. This is something that's very common across transmasculine experience. I myself have experienced people going out of their way to call me a pretty little thing in similar infantilizing and feminizing terms, often precisely in moments where I'm expressing myself in a masculine way. I'll be carrying a heavy box and someone will go out of their way to remark on how dainty and small my hands are, or that I don't look strong enough and that a man should carry it for me. If I wasn't strong enough, I just wouldn't have picked this shit up. Mind your own business. Similarly though, May is sexually harassed by another comedian backstage before a show, precisely in the moment where before they were engaging in bro talk with the other cis man comedians. The harassment and its timing are designed specifically to sexualize May and remind them that their role is as an object of lust for men rather than as a member of the group. In these situations, the message is often, quote, "You're not acting how you're supposed to, and you're not able to judge what's best for you and how you really feel. Let us, cis people, tell you what your role is supposed to be." So again, it's all that feminization, infantilization, and erasure. In the show, this forced feminization is part of why May is unable to identify their transness for such a long time. Throughout the early episodes, May continues to identify as a woman by default, despite the fact that they avowedly seek out and date only straight women. It's precisely the fact that those women are not attracted to women that provides the relationship style that May wants, at the same time as they're racked by dysphoria for not being able to be a quote-unquote real man. Fucking relatable. Perhaps that's why they accept for so long how George, their girlfriend, lies to her friends and family by pretending she's dating a cis man. In May's eyes, the problem is not that George is refusing to tell people that she's queer, but in fact that they are unable to be the man that George wants, and perhaps the one that they want to be as well. Even when they come out, May doesn't express an affirmative sense of being non-binary, at least as of the end of season 1, but rather, they neither feel like a man or a woman, and it's only George, their girlfriend, who offers that being non-binary is, a thing. And I don't want to suggest that being non-binary is always about this kind of not fitting in anywhere. Some non-binary folks do clearly have strongly held gender identities that are simply different than being men or women, or some combination or variation thereof. But for myself and for other transmasculine folks who are gender non-conforming, don't pass as men or are on the outskirts of non-binary identity, I've seen a lot of this kind of language, that feeling that we've somehow failed at or are unable to perform womanhood, while simultaneously being totally rejected from being seen and treated as men. This sort of sad resignation to gender exile. Part 4, in which I destroy a classic anime. And now we get to why you actually clicked on this video. Honestly, when I first wrote the draft of this essay and started researching it, I had no intention at all of talking about Ouran High School Host Club, but then for some ungodly reason, I started rewatching it, and I literally cannot get out of my head how much it's an allegory for gay trans experience. For those who are not familiar with this work, it's an extremely popular anime from the early 2000s based on a manga by the same name by Hattori Bisco, which falls kind of awkwardly into the armpit between shoujo or teen romance and boys' love genres. The story centers around Haruhi Fujioka, an ambiguous gendered honor student at a private preppy high school. In the first episode, Haruhi is blackmailed into joining the school's host club, in which the pretty boys of the school entertain and dote on female customers. Throughout the first episode, the show uses the motif of light switching on to show the moment when the other hosts clock Haruhi or realize that they are assigned female. Of course, creepy Kyoya clocks Haruhi immediately, but it takes some of the other characters, most notably Tamaki, much longer to realize. But the interesting thing is what happens after they realize. While Haruhi prefers to present themselves in a masculine way, they don't necessarily have a strong gender identity, at least as is expressed in the show. But the hosts are torn between their attraction to Haruhi as a boy, their need to have them present masculinely for the host club activities, and this intense drive to feminize Haruhi. Throughout the show, they
Shut up! I couldn't care less! I'm running out of patience! Haruhi, it's time you started dressing like a girl! Daddy wants you to go back to the way—
Don't go pulling out my photos without asking me first!
The more I look at this picture, the more amazed I am. How could this possibly become that?
The day before school started, one of the kids in my neighborhood got some gum in my hair. It's a real pain to get gum out of long hair, so I decided to cut it all off. I didn't care if I looked like a dude, you know?
The girl should never refer to herself as a dude! Mama! Haruhi's using those dirty boy words again!
They contrive reasons to dress Haruhi up in feminine outfits and fawn over them, constantly reminding Haruhi, in quotes, that they are a girl, and of course, piece of shit asshole Kyoya even sexually assaults them in an attempt to reinforce their gender role in a behavior that's extremely analogous to what's called corrective rape when it happens to lesbians and often to trans-masculine individuals. Just as a tangent, by the way, how is this the only shoujo anime, at least that I've ever seen, with an on-screen sexual assault scene? Like, what is that meant to convey to the tomboys, gay girls, and trans-masculine people in the audience? That, because you don't present yourself in a feminine way and you stand up for your rights, you deserve to be sexually assaulted? Fucking trash. Anyway, the thing that's abundantly clear throughout the show is that the other characters are attracted to Haruhi as a guy, and in general, that they have queer sexualities. This is also demonstrated throughout by the fact that the other 6 characters themselves kind of fall into 3 couple pairings. Tamaki and Kyoya are a couple as the quote-unquote parents of the club, with practical and rapey Kyoya as the foil to Tamaki's flamboyance and excitement. Next, we have the classic boys' love pairing of the strong reserved top Mori and the childish Shota bottom Honey. Finally, we have the twincest storyline between Hikaru and Kaoru. Oh yeah, did I mention that this anime is creepy garbage in literally every single way? I honestly found this post on the Auron wiki that summarizes it perfectly, and so I'm just gonna fucking read it. This show makes me so angry I can't even. I think it should be canceled, but honestly, you can report me or comment if you think that I'm spreading hate. I just wanted to rant because this made me so angry that I had to turn it off, and I'm surprised people like this show. Yes, I'm ranting, and that's why I'm posting this. So I'm just gonna read the section headings because it's kind of long, but you can pause and read them all. So they say, first of all, an annoying sexist episode that they expected would be banned by now. This refers to the episode in which Kyoya sexually assaults Haruhi, which is in response for Haruhi trying to prevent some other girls from being assaulted. Finally, there's the twins incest storyline, which is kind of self-explanatory. Then the person points out the height differences, which are so inaccurate it's gross, referring to the fact that both Haruhi and Honey are like exaggeratedly short in a way that kind of like makes it a bit pedophilic. And then they're kind of highlighting the hypocrisy of that the show is presented as being accepting to the LGBT community, when in fact it's extremely homophobic and transphobic throughout. And also they say that the show is not that funny. Yeah, so something I'm really not going to touch on in a lot of depth, which kind of goes to the transphobia of the whole show, is the depictions of trans feminine people in the show, because it really just goes off the rails. Or I guess, rather what I should say is that there you can see the difference between trans misogyny and the kind of transphobia that trans men face, where the characters of Haruhi's parent and her friend the innkeeper, the two trans feminine characters in the show, are presented simply as delusional or worthy of mockery, but ultimately left to their own devices, something which I obviously disagree with and don't condone. The treatment of Haruhi is in some ways more sinister. Essentially, the other main characters force femme, gaslight, and sexually assault Haruhi, so that by the end of the show, they are willing to present themselves as women, simply so that they can hide their already obviously gay shenanigans. This is something scholar Eve Sedgwick raises in the book Between Men, where she points out that many love triangles in stories are actually about two male characters' attraction toward and interactions with one another, where the female character is basically just a prop. I mean, Beauty and the Beast from Gaston's perspective is not about whether he or the Beast is going to get with Belle, it's actually about how much he's obsessed with the Beast. You can even retell Twilight from this perspective, where what Jacob really wants is not Bella, but Edward. I mean, and really, isn't that what we wanted to see too? Similarly, you can say that Haruhi is a go-between that makes acceptable the romantic tensions between Mori and Honey, or Tamaki and Kyoya, or the twins. Oh, sorry, I just have to barf. The tension between Haruhi's gender presentation and the men that are attracted to them is actually re-raised in a really interesting way in episode 22, with the introduction of the character Ritsu Kasanoda. Kasanoda originally comes to the host club to find out how Mori has become popular, where Kasanoda is considered frightening, even though they're both tall, quiet guys from mob families. In so doing, Kasanoda meets and develops a crush on Haruhi, who is presenting in boy mode at the club. Unlike the other characters, Kasanoda does the introspective work of asking himself if he really is queer, and appears to come to the answer yes, while also realizing that Haruhi is assigned female. Rather than this realization resolving his search for identity, it actually creates a bigger problem. Kasanoda sees that being masculine presenting is an integral part of Haruhi's identity, and he knows that he can't change that. Ultimately, he decides to stop pursuing Haruhi because he realizes that it's not right to make Haruhi present in a different way than is natural for them, just to allow Kasanoda to appear straight. But Kasanoda is not ready to come out, and he sees that there is an irresolvable tension there. Because Bossa Nova is a fucking based woke king, and he realizes that it's really shitty to date a closeted person, and it's especially shitty for a trans person to date a closeted person, because it essentially invalidates the trans person identity. Because if you're a queer man and you're dating a trans man to hide that you're queer, it requires that you and everyone else see your trans masculine partner as a woman, which is pretty shitty. Honestly, the Kasanoda storyline is where the show should have ended, but no, they dragged Ouran High School Host Club out for another 4 episodes just to needlessly introduce Tamaki and Kyoya's parents, force Haruhi to fight a girl for Tamaki's love, insist that they were happy to be messed around with by these assholes the whole time, and then finally, the show closes off with Kyoya and Tamaki's dads, who also have the hots for Haruhi, fighting over which of their sons will get to marry Haruhi, a choice which, of course, Haruhi has no say whatsoever in. And so, the forced femming is complete, and I have to go scream. Goodbye. Whew, that was a lot. I just want to take a second to acknowledge that that was a lot. If I had to sum up this whole mess, I would say that, like, for trans men who are non-passing, non-white, are gender non-conforming or who are queer, which is to say, the overwhelming majority of trans men, at least at some point in their life, having relationships with men is a sexual minefield. On the one hand, queer trans masculine folks desire authentic queer sexuality and romantic relationships, but on the other hand, the people who date us often do so for their own reasons, whether that's a level of fetishization or because they don't want to acknowledge their own queer sexuality. You know, being the recipient of people's kind of weird fetish for cute young boys while also having the experience of, you know, people not willing to be honest about their sexuality and your gender identity is really demoralizing. As one Redditor put it, like, only in their twisted minds would dating a trans man be a good way to hide that you're attracted to men, but unfortunately is really common. And I think that's why, like, I just have this tendency toward gender abolitionism. I kind of made a joke at the beginning about, like, being post-structuralist, but I think that it's actually a really appealing ideology. Like, maybe if I was able to seamlessly present myself as a man, I might accept that it was possible to actually reform the categories of men and women and maybe add some non-binary identities and just have that, like, expansion and redefinition, because then maybe there would be a place for me. But as it stands, as a high-voiced, baby-faced, 5-foot-tall trans mask, I share May's concern that there might be no place for me, for people like us who are too masculine to pass as women, but who are not able to transition fully enough to be read as men. So we may as well just burn it all down. I know that's not really the tidy conclusion you folks might want to hear, but these are complex and entrenched issues. I guess I would say if you're a cis person watching this, maybe a good place to start is by asking yourself, are you attracted to trans people? Why or why not? Which groups of trans people? How does that square with or conflict against your other ideas about your sexuality? I think it's only by starting to ask ourselves these questions that we can get to the roots of what we actually think rather than what we think we think. I was just talking to my partner yesterday because they were doing like an implicit bias quiz, and one of the interesting things about like racial implicit bias, which I think is also true of transphobia, is that you can think that you're a supporter, that you honestly think that you're doing something good for these folks by the way that you feel towards them and the way that you behave towards them, but your real thoughts and ideas show through in unexpected ways. Just like the guy who I dated, who when I discovered that he was a chaser, I confronted him and told him that his fetish for trans people was actually creepy. He said that that was his sexual orientation and that I should be flattered. But that's just not how it works, you know? And like upon discovering that piece of information, it actually cast my sexual experiences with that person in a totally different light. And in the same way, you know, the way that we feel about gender non-conforming people, even if we think that we are enlightened and that we think the right things, the way that we actually feel often comes through, and we should be wary about the way that we use other people as crutches for our own identities, whether it's in the context of dating or other things, you know, like in the same way that someone can have their one black friend that they bring around to show that they're all woke. People can also use relationships with trans people for a variety of social purposes that are pretty fucked. And also, just as a conclusion, please God, can we not with Ouran High School Host Club anymore? Thank you and good night.